All right, great. Well, thanks so much for joining, everyone. As folks come in, I'm happy to kind of go through it all again. But I know some of you are familiar names. You've joined previous workshops. I'll just paste the code of conduct in the chat again for anyone who's new. And what we'll be going through today is on designing with inclusivity. If you'd wanted to follow along, here I'll post the links to both the YouTube channel and the workshop for today. Great, so that's all in the chat now. All right, sweet. So if it's just going to be a few of us today, we can keep this very casual. So we're talking about designing with inclusivity in mind. Before I begin, though, I'd love to know kind of who's in the room and your experience / exposure, to design in general. This could be anything from like graphic design, web design. I'd just love to know where you're all coming from. It helps me cater some of my language. So if you wanted to type in the chat, like any experience that you've had, any design work that you've done before, that's great. All right, sweet. So we'll begin. I'll just consider it as if, oh, Noni said they're a BI developer and interested in UI and web design. Okay, sweet. Okay, great. Well, hopefully, especially when it comes to UI, hopefully today gives you some value in that and gives you some consideration as to when you're, making some personal projects or working for a company as a UI designer. Hopefully that helps you. And I know inclusive design is like this big field right now. Everyone's talking about it. People are trying to be way more mindful of how they're doing their design. So I think this could be pretty valuable to you. Hitesh said that they're a QA lead and worked with WCAG compliance. Okay, great. Peggy's full stack web. Yeah, you need to make accessible web UIs for end users. Yeah, great. So as we're talking about this today, there is a difference between accessible design, universal design, and inclusive design, and we'll talk about that later. But I think all three of those will be very helpful to all of you. So, all right, so we can begin. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. We'll spend probably 30 minutes or 35 minutes today just chatting about inclusive design. I know some of you have a lot of experience with design already, but I hope you still find some value in rethinking sort of the diversity behind how you design things. Not all design is like for apps or web or graphic design, like social media design. Some things could be as, like civil engineering or architecture, like designs that are out in the world and have physical presence. So it's just some things to consider when you're thinking about being inclusive. The definition of inclusive design, which is also called universal design in some places, is that it makes places, people, products, services usable by everyone, regardless of age, ability, or circumstance. It's based on that simple principle that designing for the widest range of people creates better designs and helps everyone. And really the goal of inclusive design practices is to recognize any barriers that you have before you make them. So before you design anything, what barriers are there that you're not considering? Really creating things that support the reality of human diversity. And with that, we can, empower people with different disabilities from different backgrounds and really help advance lives. Once you do that, it actually helps with like innovation, better inclusion, better products that you make out into the world. So yeah, we can dive straight into that. So the agenda that I've set up for today is that we'll spend 10 minutes talking about inclusive product design. We'll go 15 minutes into the principles of inclusive design, especially when it comes from the Microsoft perspective, and then 10 minutes into the human diversity factors to consider when you're practicing inclusive design. So something to note is that this presentation is obviously very tech focused, especially Microsoft focused. Inclusive design is practiced very differently in very different companies and different organizations, so please bear that in mind. I know companies like Slack and Salesforce, they have their own design principles, and a lot of companies have created their own design toolkits and all that stuff. So just keep that in mind that there are a lot of differences because it's not like accessibility. So for accessibility, for example, we've talked about this a couple times in previous workshops where accessibility, there's standards that are globally accepted, like web standards or app standards that anytime you design something, you have to make them, aligned to those standards. But inclusive design is very different. It's about intent and motive and empathy and things like that, which is not very measurable, or there's no set standard for it. So different companies do it differently. So I'll just be talking about Microsoft's perspective, and hopefully that's something that helps you out and as you're learning or trying to transition careers. But that said, Microsoft's inclusive design toolkit and their practices are kind of considered like industry best practices. They're one of the few and one of the first tech companies really to kind of make that really big leap into being inclusive in their designs, and published a bunch of stuff about it and created resources for a lot of people. And then a bunch of other companies started following suit. So it really is kind of like a good first place to go if you're considering being more inclusive in how you design things. A lot of you have previously joined workshops before, so I won't spend too much time on the About Me slide, but recap for folks that might watch the recording later. My name's Eamon. I'm the Reactor Program Manager in Toronto. What that means is that I manage kind of the programming and technical programming and community building within Toronto for the Reactor, which is Microsoft's team built on supporting developers and startups through workshops like this. There's versions of me around the world with different locations in, London or Tel Aviv or Sydney, New York, San Francisco, and a bunch of other locations. So thank you so much for joining me specifically. Outside of work, I run a B Corp creating children's literature. I'm an advocate for STEAM inclusion and diversity and equity. And my background in design is previously as, working in web design and UX design. All right, so we'll skip over that really quickly and jump straight into what is inclusive design. So jumping straight into definition, inclusive designs are usable by everyone, regardless of age, ability, and circumstance. And we talked about this earlier, but it's based on the simple principle that when you design for the widest range of people, it creates better designs and benefits everyone. So this really is kind of a approach, like it's a mental model approach to creating solutions in an all-embracing manner to deliver an experience that has mainstream appeal. So if you want me to elaborate on that, I can, but I think it's basically just make something that everyone can use, and it's for the mainstream. So it becomes kind of normalized in your day-to-day life. So Microsoft's Chief Accessibility Officer, her name is Jenny LeFleury. She's really kind of driving that change within the company. She began losing her hearing at age 5, and so she has this famous quote, disability isn't just my strength, it's our strength. So because she's in this position, of power in a company, she has the privilege to use her life, her learned experiences and her life experiences, kind of bring about change from the top down and really kind of champion being inclusive and being accessible. So it's that vantage point that she's implementing within Microsoft that helps us, improve the products and features and really kind of create accessibility for a wide range of abilities and make an impact that way, which is why it's so helpful. And I've talked about this previously as well, but you really need people who have lived experience or who have insight to really speak to the audiences that they're catering to. There's this famous saying, and we'll talk about that later as well, where it's nothing about us without us. And it's this famous quote that is really driving the change behind like social justice and social improvement for people with disabilities, where they really need to be in the room where the decisions about them are being made. And this is true for anybody. You can't have, diversity and talks and creating products for maybe people who are Black or people who are from different ethnic backgrounds without, learning from and empathizing with people from those backgrounds and really helping them speak for themselves. So Jenny LeFleury is really pioneering that within the company. And so I really recommend you kind of check that out. And we talked about how other companies have different viewpoints. So this whole thing about disability being strength is the vantage point that Microsoft uses. Disabilities or different abilities cover a whole range of experiences that I'm sure will apply to all of us at some point in our lives. And we've talked about this earlier as well, but all of us will experience disability at some point. There's the concept of disability is very different than what people usually think. It's not, using a wheelchair or not being able to see or have lowered vision. There's many things like permanent, temporary, situational differences and disabilities. So there's a lot of things that I'm sure all of us already have experienced or will at some point experience. So the products you use or the websites you make really depend on how you're making them, for all people to use. All right, sweet. So we'll go into this one quote that Satya Nadella, who's the CEO of Microsoft, used. He said that the most profound technologies are those that disappear. They weave themselves into the fabric of everyday life until they're indistinguishable from it. Long term, we believe that designing with and for people with disabilities will lead to innovations in ubiquitous, inclusive computing, which I know it's a lot of words, but he basically said that accessibility isn't optional. I know it's super wordy, but it covers quite a bit about inclusive design principles that we'll talk about soon. But what he said is about being ubiquitous is really helpful. Ubiquitous basically means something that's found everywhere. When you have an accessible design or technology or product and it becomes ubiquitous and widely used, they're no longer considered, special features or something for people with disabilities. It becomes mainstream. It becomes normal. So when you're practicing inclusive design, it should make a product more accessible, but it's not really a process to meet all accessibility standards. So ideally, accessibility and inclusive design, they do work together to make accessible experiences, but they should be open to all without, meeting any specific standard. So an example of ubiquitous design is the roadside curb. A curb cut, which is that little cut where you see the curb kind of cut down and mesh with the ground level, is an example of how design can help everyone. So on a raised sidewalk curb, these cutouts were originally added for wheelchair users so they could transition from the road to the sidewalk. They were originally designed to make these streets accessible. I think one of the first few curb cuts were installed in Michigan in like 1945, so back in the day for disabled World War II veterans. But today, everyone benefits from these curb cuts, whether you have a physical disability or not. When you're pushing a stroller, you have mobility issues, or you're carrying physical heavy objects, or you're riding a bike, or in so many other situations, the curb cut is extremely useful to everyone. So that's an example of a ubiquitous design where it's kind of just become commonplace now. Like we don't even notice that this is something that was implemented to be accessible. It's just commonplace that, yeah, of course there should be a curb cut for everybody to use, right? So this actually started a whole movement called the curb cut effect. So now a lot of designers will say, oh yes, because of the curb cut effect, and they'll apply it to other things that have also become ubiquitous and like apply to everybody now, not just to say people with disabilities, and benefit everyone and are just better designs. So that's one example. I'd love to hear if you have any other examples of ubiquitous design. You can put it in the chat if you think of any everyday examples that have helped. Some of them that I was thinking of were like day mode and night mode on your phones. They originally started for folks with vision difficulties, but now everyone uses them. On your phone in the nighttime, it's better for your eyes to just go to night mode. It's more healthy for your eyes to not be looking at blue light all the time. So it has this yellow light built in your phones all the time now. So that's one thing that's kind of ubiquitous. Subtitles, very ubiquitous. Now everything comes with subtitles usually, like any YouTube player, Netflix, Amazon Prime. If you're watching online videos, it's not just for folks who are hard of hearing. It's for anybody who wants to read a subtitle. It's always implemented. So that's an example of ubiquitous design that people originally related to people who were just hard of hearing and they wanted to watch a show that's what they would use it for. But now it's just become kind of normal. And yeah, so that's just something to think about. Another really good example that someone talked about online that I found on Medium, like they published in a blog post, where a good example of inclusive design is doorknobs, something that I hadn't thought about before. The traditional circle doorknob is not very accessible to people who might have their hands full. So you'd have to put down your things and then turn the doorknob. So then they came out with a new one called the lever, which is, like the pull down one. It is more accessible and more inclusive than the doorknob, and it's simple, it's not super fancy, you could open it with your elbow. However, it's still not great. So then they came out with the push bar, which is just like, you push it in and the door opens. That's great. You could even push it with like your hip or something. But if someone had a stroller, maybe it would be hard for them to kind of push the door open. So they'd have to move the stroller around and then push it open. So that's not super accessible either. I mean, it is more inclusive than the previous iteration, but they haven't thought about, oh, how would this subset of the population use it? If they had objects in front of them, how would they use this push lever door? So then came the automatic door. I mean, all of us have mass, like we are a being. So it can just sense you and open the door. So what it really shows is that the products you create can cater to a large range of human beings. What we constantly think about is that is normal or average or considered mainstream. We really have to rethink that sometimes, because you think, yeah, a doorknob, that's the most common mainstream thing ever. But really, there's so many iterations that you could make to be more and more inclusive and accessible to a larger population of people who are usually excluded out of those thought processes. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Something to consider, and this is a pretty important quote, is that accessibility is an attribute, while inclusive design is a method. And I'll explain that in a bit. But inclusive design is for those people who want to make great products for the largest number of people. And it's really defined as a design methodology. So it's not really like, oh, these are inclusive design practices that you must do. Like everything must be left aligned and this color or that color. Like that's not really about that. It's more so of a thought process that enables and really draws on a full range of human diversity. Understanding the relationship between inclusive design and accessibility brings some more insight into that, where accessibility is really defined as the qualities that make an experience open to everyone, while inclusive design is a professional discipline or a professional thought process that helps to achieve accessibility. So it's, accessibility comes first, and inclusive design helps accessibility, basically. And this method of this saying that accessibility is an attribute and inclusive design is a method is something that Microsoft has implemented as like a big quote to drive their entire, design teams and how they think. They use that as kind of their driving motto. The foundational belief for all of it is that exclusion happens when you solve problems using our own biases. So we talked about inclusion and bias a couple of weeks ago, and I know a bunch of you were in that chat as well, but I'm happy to dive a little bit deeper into that, where, as designers, you should really seek out exclusions. Exclusions in the traditional sense are basically anyone who's really excluded from considerations, from ideas, from society. They're not considered mainstream. So when you're designing for people with who are excluded or who are kind of on the fringe or edges of society, you will create better products, better designs, new ideas, be more inclusive, be more innovative, like all of those things. So there's actually an inclusive design document that Microsoft published that I'll put in the chat here. It's like the Inclusive Design Toolkit. Here, I'll put that in the chat there. A lot of what I'm saying is actually coming from that toolkit. But yeah, basically what that really means is that you want to seek out exclusions and use them as opportunities. Because when you do, just naturally, you will make better designs by doing that. Designing inclusively doesn't mean you're making one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways for everyone to participate in an experience, and have them, feel the same sense of belonging, feel the same sense of enjoyment from using that. So if you're making a website, you want them to have a similar level of experience as someone who you've designed traditionally for. So that's something to think about. Yeah, and then when you really get down to the specifics of inclusive design, it really focuses on kind of tangible, measurable concepts and the ability to define items objectively, and we'll talk about that soon. But really that first step is to understand those less tangible and equally important things that are kind of going to guide your design. The goal really is to have inclusive design and accessibility work in harmony together to create experiences that are adaptable and useful for everyone. Yeah, when you do, so while talking about accessibility again, when you follow inclusive design practices, the product or that you create is not guaranteed to meet all accessibility standards, but if it does help more people, that's great. The goal really is to just design things and deliver products that are usable, accessible, and open to all. And that really means including and learning from people with different perspectives. So I know that's kind of vague, but hopefully this slide helps. I know that we've been talking about like principles and blah, blah, blah for a while, but this is kind of the one-shot summary of everything. When you first start exploring inclusive design, people will really use these three terms often. So things like universal design, accessibility, and inclusive design. But even though they're used commonly quite often, there is a distinction between the three. Universal design is defined as the design of an environment so that it can be accessed and used in the widest possible range of situations without needing to be adapted. So it's something that will work for everyone in all scenarios, and you don't really need to adapt the situation at all because it'll work. That's like something very universal. It's a noun. It's really rooted in kind of architecture and environmental design. So things like slides or swings or benches. So that's kind of universal types of design. And it really kind of emphasizes the end solution. So a bench is for sitting, so it's designed for that end solution of the act of sitting. So that's kind of a universal thought process behind it. And to be simple and intuitive. So, very straightforward. The second distinction is that universal design is considered a one size fits all. So a bench that fits all, like one solution that will usually just apply to anybody, while inclusive design is considered a one size fits one. So when you create something that a very specific person who's not a mainstream consideration would be able to use it. So that's kind of one distinction between the two. And accessibility, as we already talked about earlier, are the qualities that make an experience open to everybody. So it's more of an adjective. And, there's standards that are used globally that kind of grew out of policies and laws. But really, inclusive design, or even universal design for that matter, should start with a solid understanding of accessibility fundamentals and then build from there. All right, so I know we talked a lot about context, but we'll go straight into the three principles that Microsoft uses for their inclusive design. And these are the three core principles, where how Microsoft really approaches these principles is to deliver increased access to people, reduce friction, so remove some barriers for them in some way, and give more emotional context. So kind of trying to understand that it's not just about functionality of different products, but also how people feel when they use certain things or interact with certain things. So those are the kind of guiding thoughts behind why these principles were created, which are recognizing exclusion, solve for one, extend to many, and learn from diversity. And we'll go into them now. So the first one, recognizing exclusion, basically just means that disability is not a personal health condition, but a mismatch of human interactions. And I'll dive into that now, where, every person really in the world has biases. It's completely false if you say something like, I'm not biased, I have no bias, I'm not biased against anyone, because it happens unintentionally. Everyone has them. It's one of those things where people say everyone is a little bit racist. Like, you have these built-in biases based on how you're raised, and you might not even realize that, as you're going about your day. It can be very unintentional. Just that when you see somebody or see a situation, the first thought that comes in your mind, it can be like an intrusive thought even, what is that? And you have to think about that based on the biases of how you were raised, maybe the culture you come from, what you associate different values with. So for example, if you see someone who's maybe wearing some torn clothing or it's a little shabby, obviously your brain will instantly make some type of judgment about them, even though you might not actually think like that. Your brain will just make that assumption based on maybe some movies you've seen about people being dressed shabby or something. That's just common, like that's just something that you have to be aware of and accept. So obviously that leaks into how you work and how you design. A lot has changed since the formal definition of disabilities came out by the World Health Organization in like 1980. They published all these definitions of disabilities. And when they came out, a lot has changed. How the limitations of the word disability. Originally, it was described as a personal attribute, like so-and-so is a disabled person, like how I would be considered, I am a young woman. So that's just like a personal attribute of a being. But now that's really changed. So now it's considered more context dependent. Going back to kind of inclusive Microsoft design toolkit, how we define it is that in the context of health experience, a disability is a restriction or a lack of ability to perform any activity in a manner that's considered normal for the human being. So this was what it was considered before, but now it's really changed to disability is not a health problem. It's moved from health to be more context-driven, where it's a complex phenomenon where it's more about the interactions between the features of a person's body and the features of the society in which they live. So it's like that mismatch of what features I have and the features of the society in which I live. So how do we interact? What relationship do we have based on those features? And if there's a match or a mismatch within that. So it's less about my health and how I am as a person, and more about why is there a mismatch between how I interact and live in the world. So the goal really is to embrace that disparity and the differences between individuals and their situation, their environment, and society as a whole. When you design for inclusivity, it opens your products and services to be used by more people, but it also reflects how people really are. All humans grow and adapt to the world around them, and you want your designs to reflect that. A disability is only as impairing as the culture around it allows it to be. And it really happens at the points of interaction between a person and society. So that's kind of the main takeaway from this thing, is that it really is in those interactions where you have to be more inclusive, where, for example, any physical, cognitive, which is brain related, social exclusion, those are the results of mismatched interactions. So it's really a designer's responsibility to know how design would affect those interactions. Most design schools and design classes now, when you go through their design exercises and like trying to create or like prototype some mock-up of a website or something, they'll do this exercise called creating personas. Some of you might already be familiar with that, but before it used to be, how would a male person use this product? And then you think about what they would do, and then you prototype some design for it. So it's about creating kind of like a hypothetical person that would use your product or interact with your product. But now they really say that you should not make personas based on the mainstream, but make personas of the exclusions. So folks who you might not typically consider, and design for them. And that will give you, way more insight, and you'll create better products out of it based on how people like that will use products. Based on that, it'll actually help all people use your products. So for example, maybe they'll tell you to think of someone who has cognitive challenges and uses crutches and is an immigrant, and they're over 80, for example. So that's a very specific user who isn't really considered normal. Like that's very a niche person. So when you're designing for something that they can definitely use, like you're designing an app or a website, and if they can use it and it's easy for them to use and comfortable and they'll enjoy using it, then definitely the mainstream society will also enjoy it. So it's really about that. Another thing to really recognize when you're thinking about exclusions is that they're not always permanent. Some things are temporary, like people might have broken arm, or contextual exclusion, like they're ordering food in another country and they don't speak the language. But those are still considered exclusions. So consider that when you're designing something. All right. The next one is solve for one and extend to many. This is something that we've already talked about quite a bit, but everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. As people interact with designs, we're all going to experience exclusion at some point. Interactive design really works for a spectrum. So it's not about accessibility as much as it is creating stuff for a spectrum of people or a range of people, and connecting those people together in, who are facing that similar circumstance. When you design for someone with a permanent disability, you should also be aware that there are individuals with temporary or situational limitations. Like this, there's that image on the side, which shows, for example, someone who has a touch disability could be permanent disability of only having one arm. They could have a temporary disability of having a broken arm, or situational where they're a new parent and they're holding a baby for 10, 20 hours a day. So how are they going to interact with your product? So thinking about that is something to really consider. For example, closed captions, where you actually initially created for people who are hard of hearing, but they also benefit someone who's trying to watch a webinar in the middle of an office, or support someone who's maybe a child who's learning how to read. So this thought process is called a persona spectrum. And it's about designing for a range of people. So thinking about all the inclusions and exclusions, and personas that you've considered, and design for a range of them, not just when they're permanent or when they're temporary, just everything across the umbrella. And so when you solve for one and extend to many is really that thought process behind it, where you're creating for one person and it spreads across a spectrum at the end of the day. Okay, we'll skip some of the sad stuff because I know we're short on time. But yeah, this kind of image has really become a norm for Microsoft now. Like we use this quite a bit. Another thing to consider is persona network, which is another thought process. So, you create personas, you think about the persona spectrum across permanent, temporary, situational, contextual, but something you usually might not have thought about is persona network. So this includes family, coworkers, friends, or other people who might interact with your primary persona. So that if you've made that persona of, for example, that 80-year-old man who has cognitive difficulties, doesn't speak the language, as an immigrant, so all of those things, but really how that person, they might even have a permanent caretaker, or they might have family members that help interact with kind of their day-to-day lives quite a bit. So when you're creating something, how would that person who is in their network use that product as well? So that's something to think about as well. And the spectrum then becomes a network that you're designing for. So just like this whole thought is really about rethinking how you think about things. So you see disability differently, and you understand that exclusion really helps us extend a solution for one person into millions of people, but you really need to solve for that one person first. And then the last one, the third principle, is learning from diversity. And it's that thought of nothing about us without us, and learning from the source. Inclusive design's principle, and this is true for all companies across the board, it's just like one of the pillars of inclusive design is placing people at the center, so placing the user at the center. This is also called user-centered design in a couple of places, but human beings themselves are really kind of the true experts in adapting to diversity. When there's experiences or environments that don't really serve us or cater to us, we'll adapt in new ways that designers might not have considered before. When you observe and learn from like the unique nature of humans, their emotional situation, and how they navigate the environment, your design has actually improved quite a bit. So a lot of companies and governments actually invest like millions and millions of dollars into user research and surveys and focus groups and behavioral studies, and they'll do all these things because no matter what, or no matter how many assumptions you make, whatever you think how a human will react in a specific situation is probably not how they will actually react. And this is true for everything, like apps or websites. I know you're first some of the folks in the call who are interested in UI, which is like creating user interfaces for people. One of the first few steps is, UX, UI kind of work hand in hand, which is user research and user experience with interfaces. So interfaces like websites, how people will navigate a website or how they'll experience a website is very different than what you might think. So they often tell you you have to kind of get them research, have people test it out and do some research and build on top of it. Because if you just create something and push it out into the world, you have no idea how people will react or engage with it. So it's just a worse design at the end of the day. So that's just something to think about. That saying in the disability community, nothing about us without us. If you're designing for people who have disabilities, you're not, sorry, the saying is you're designing for people who have disabilities, not for people with disabilities. So the person is really kind of the center of all of it. One example of this is the Xbox adaptive controller. The team really kind of worked with the accessible gaming community. So they didn't work with people who have accessibility needs, but people who are in the gaming community who have accessibility needs to kind of gain insight on device functionality, on what form and shape it should take to help the user. But as they were doing that, they kind of found this thing out where one organization raised a point that since the controllers don't really look like traditional controllers, like on PlayStations and Xboxes, like, holding it with two hands, people who have disabilities might feel left out because they're not gaming the same way. So they suggested that a traditional game controller would just be a game controller, but while this seems like another thing, so you're not really you might not feel like you're gaming, even though you technically are playing a game. So just some insight. Obviously, how can you really change that? So it's just something to think about that they wouldn't have even considered unless someone from the accessibility gaming community organization brought it up. Like that's something so outside the realm of an able-bodied person's point of view. So that's something that came up. Another thing to think about, a lot of existing tech in, areas like gaming and stuff, they tend to be really fun and make it like colorful and look like toys because the industry is, trying to engage parents to buy these things for their kids. But really then what about the adults who have accessibility concerns and also want a game? They might feel like, oh, we're not the right audience. They might feel like treated like children. So that's kind of something to think about. After the controller was released, the reviews and feedback kind of really reflected that insight, where we found that when you're designing for people who are, at the center of the process, they told us that, we don't want something that looks childish. We want something cool and awesome. So then once the form factor of it was more geared towards looking cool versus looking fun, more kids were excited to use it. And that's the feedback that they got afterwards as well. So that's just something to think about, that place people at the center. Don't try to simulate their experience. A lot of people, when they're designing for people who are blind, will like wear a blindfold and use that product or service as if, oh, this kind of is the same experience. You can't see is the same thing if I'm wearing a blindfold. But no, you probably shouldn't do that. You should just talk to somebody who is blind or has those difficulties and disabilities and really get it from the source versus just assuming what they might feel. All right, so I know I'm speaking pretty fast, so I'll slow down a little bit. Learning how people adapt to the world means spending time with them, understanding their experience, and really understanding their perspective. When you do this well, not only do you recognize the barriers that they might encounter, but you recognize kind of some of their motivations that we've talked about, and like some of those shared human connections. So all humans care about things like being safe, feeling love from their family and friends, being part of a community, feeling joy. Those are shared human experiences that are universal across all of us as a species. So really consider that versus considering the differences and the exclusions that we've talked about, that you're designing for the exclusion, but not for the exclusion specifically, but the person that's feeling that exclusion. So really that helps. So give more context to how you're designing things. All right, so next we'll talk about human functions and aspects. Here, let me just pull up my notes really quickly. There's a quick video that we can watch that talks about all these things in 2 minutes, and it probably summarizes it a lot better than I can. Let me know if you can hear it, but I'll play it now.
Human factors to consider when practicing inclusive design. Recognizing these factors helps us understand the barriers a person may face when using technology, or help facilitators find solutions to overcome these barriers. Cognition affects the way a person learns. This includes difficulty with concentration, focus, memory, judgment, comprehension, problem solving, and reasoning. By minimizing interruptions or distractions, the person can concentrate on the task at hand. Mobility affects a person's ability to move and use body parts effectively. By providing alternate options like lightweight devices and speech recognition programs, this eliminates the need for prolonged physical interaction with the device. Vision involves both the presence of sight and the brain's ability to process the information the eyes see. For people with limited vision, interacting with technology often requires the use of other senses like touch and hearing. By optimizing visual information, we can make it easier to access technologies that might not otherwise be available. For a person with hearing loss, exclusion occurs when information is conveyed only through sound. The degree of hearing loss varies across a wide spectrum, so solutions must also be varied and allow the user to choose what works for them. Voice, speech, and communication affects a person's ability to produce speech that's clear enough or loud enough to be understood. A person with hearing loss may also choose to communicate through nonverbal means. By providing a variety of options of communication, everyone is able to participate in the same discussion. Sensation is a person's ability to detect senses like touch, pain, vision, or the movement and positioning of their body. Experiences that affect the vestibular system, such as flashing lights, vibrations, or moving screen content, may result in exclusion, discomfort, or even seizures during product experience. To learn more about inclusive design...
All right, we can skip that part. But yeah, here's going back to that slide. Really those human diversity factors that the video talked about, which are, cognitive, mobility, vision, hearing, speech, sensory, like these four are considered really a framework. They help provide that framework to support, designers' education and exploration into inclusive design. Using this structure can really help guide and educate you when you're, thinking about creating awareness of key insights or information for your designs. It's really important to reiterate, and I know I've said this a bunch of times already, but these barriers can and often co-occur, like they happen at the same time or they overlap. So these factors are really meant to be used as a resource to identify any potential barriers that a person might encounter. This list is not complete, and it will continue to grow over time as societies age and there's more disability concerns that come up. The list will change often on and on. But this really is kind of a generic framework that's considered a global standard best practice of considerations to keep in mind as you're thinking about being inclusive. So, exploring and understanding and defining these additional factors and then weaving these details together to better understand people with disabilities can lead to better and more comprehensive design. One thing that I do want to chat about really quickly. Here, let me just scroll down to my notes really quickly. Yeah, so those three key principles that we talked about earlier is, how do you build on top of that? What components do you need to be aware of to eventually, create impactful design? Functioning is really important to that. We've really come to see inclusive design as a set of perspectives and practices that champion that human diversity. But before you create anything or put pencil to paper, you need to recognize those barriers that people with these six, functionalities would consider, whether that's permanent, temporary, or situational. It can obviously be very challenging because there's so many unique challenges and functional areas of concern, but this is a good starting point. But yeah, so it's actually very unlikely that they'll happen in isolation, like we talked about. Two or more do happen at the same time. An example of this would be things like having a stroke. Having a stroke can impact a person in many different ways. They could have coordination issues or paralysis, but they could also be affected cognitively, and they might have difficulties with maybe processing thought or processing memory. It could even cause blind spots. So when you're designing, think about these co-occurring barriers that can empower people to achieve more. Some other examples as you're thinking about this might be things like cerebral palsy, autism, cataracts. Like there's so many different ways that they affect a human being. It's not just one thing like cataracts, vision. It's not as simple as that. So that's just something to keep in mind. And now that we're close to our ending time, I just wanted to quickly summarize some of the main key takeaways from this workshop. So really take a moment to consider how you've benefited from solutions that were originally designed for someone with different abilities. So, take note of your own permanent, temporary, or situational disabilities that prevent you from interacting with society in the way that is meant to be interacted with, in the way that other people are interacting with society. Think about how those exclusions affect you on a day-to-day basis. Observe how people from different circumstances are excluded as well, in something that maybe you can do without any barriers. So think about that and think about how your privileges affect your day-to-day life. Really being inclusive starts with changing your own perception. And to summarize, inclusive design is a set of perspectives and practices that champion human diversity. So it's not about the nitty-gritty tools and resources that you should be doing in your design, like fonts and colors, but it's more about an overarching thinking. This approach is guided by 3 simple design principles, which are recognizing exclusion, solve for one, extend to many, and learning from diversity, like we talked about earlier. And being inclusive really begins with changing your own perception. The benefit of designing through these practices pays off in many ways, but it helps, increase access, reduces friction, provides more emotional context, unlearns a lot of biases within yourself and within products and services that you create. So those are just some ways that you can help, lead towards a better society. Traditionally, user-centered design, which is, that image on the right there, it really starts with user-centered design, and it has many techniques to these, creating these designs, which are like clarifying human needs, personas that we talked about, scenarios, usability testing. Like there's so many things that you can dive deep into, like the specifics within that design. But, you need the right tools, the ways to check or balance or measure the inclusivity of your design. But really, it's beyond that a little bit, where the impact of inclusive design is more than just the product that people use. It's a shift in mindset, shift in method, shift in behavior. And really measuring that benefits includes measuring the shift in our culture and in ourselves. So this image that's on the right is a really good byproduct of how we design, where you start with the user, but you change your mindset. That affects the methods you use, the tools that you use, and then you can actually be a little bit more inclusive and lead to the betterment of society. And I know it sounds so like out there, but that's just something to think about, where, like going back to that example of the curb cut effect, really not intended. It kind of just happened. Somehow it just changed into this design practice that is benefiting everyone around the globe now. All it took was that first person to say, hey, people with wheelchairs aren't able to use the sidewalk. Let's do this thing in 1945, which is not even that long ago. And then it's kind of just become global best practice now. So I hope that helps you quite a bit. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to answer. I know we have like 10 minutes still left in the call, but I'd love to hear your thoughts or any feedback that you have. And that kind of concludes the content for today. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. You can unmute as well. That's perfectly fine. And I'll post a quick survey link in the chat. If you have any feedback from today's session, please let me know. It helps me design future surveys, future workshops for all of you. I know a couple of you filled out surveys for past workshops, and it really helped. So I'm glad for that. Thanks, Constantinos. You just gave me a little thumbs up and a heart. That's great. And then just some context. All the content from today, obviously I pulled it from a bunch of different resources from Microsoft, but I'd really recommend looking into it further. Oh, hi, Dish. Fantastic presentation, very enlightening. Oh, thank you so much. That's very kind of you to say. But yeah, I pretty much followed a lot of it from Microsoft Learn, which here, I'll just post that here in the chat as well. Yeah, so Microsoft Learn is this platform where they have, learning paths and online learning resources and certifications in different technologies like Power BI and so on. But they had the whole thing about accessibility and inclusive design. So I started from there and then took a lot of our research from other parts of Microsoft Inclusive Design, and I've put the link to that a little bit higher up. But if you're interested in inclusion and inclusive design, I really recommend looking it up and kind of getting different perspectives. One of the bias, I mean, we talked about biases earlier, but just having one perspective of inclusive design, which is Microsoft's inclusive design, is probably not as healthy of having a holistic understanding. So hopefully that helps. Any other questions? All right, great.
Hi, Iman. How are you?
Oh, hi, Ahmad. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine. Very nice. Very nice. Now, this was the most informative one in the past few sessions you've done. Okay, thanks for that.
Oh, thank you.
One thing I had about while you were speaking, okay, while you were briefing us, there are about 2-3 things I just wanted to let you know.
Okay.
You know the example you gave about the doorknob,
Yes.
as a issue with accessibility. You're exactly right. You're exactly right that even with a lever type knob design, okay, it is actually quite inaccessible for some people. So let's say thing is, you know me, I normally use myself as an example, okay, example, okay, and I'm sure that there are other people around the world who have the similar conditions or whatever. So remember I told you that I've got RA, rheumatoid arthritis, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And now because of that, what happens is, the joints of your hands, okay, or any other joints around your body, they become sore and your muscle stress just drops like a stone, basically. Yes. So let's say, in order to use the lever doorknob, okay, you need to really push down, right? Okay.
Yeah.
When you get if you got RA, rheumatoid arthritis, or there's another condition, and that is called sensory neuropathy. Now, in sensory neuropathy, that condition basically is that it involves there's damage along your nervous system network, okay, in different parts. So because normally in your nervous system you get pulses like, for example, from one place or one part of your body to the other. Okay.
Okay.
It's quite similar to RA. But anyway, in terms of the doorknob, even for example, if you try and push it down really hard, and sometimes even in RA, as I said, you can't really push it down really damn much properly, because then you really have to give all your attention to push it down and then open the door. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that respect is
That's true.
limiting. It's extremely limiting, actually. Okay. In that respect, I think the handle doorknob, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously is exactly the round ball one that's impossible. But I mean, even the handle one is quite problematic, actually.
Mm-hmm. So people, I mean, that's a really good example that you mentioned, that even applying force to push it down and open it is something that people hadn't considered with a doorknob before. So that's a really good insight.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think I'm sure that most probably they don't think when they designed the doorknob, the lever one, that they didn't consider that the person using the actual doorknob might have a condition with them which might actually reduce their muscle capacity. Actually,
exactly.
That's the thing, because the handle doorknob, the lever doorknob, has to use your muscles to do it. Yes, but if your muscles are, because of your nerves, obviously, yes, because of your muscles, if your muscles are compromised, if your muscle strength is totally finished, or even the dexterity amount it decreased for some reason, so then the concept of the lever doorknob is null and void, don't you think? I think.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so for example, No, I mean, for example, thing is then while you were talking, I was maybe thinking that maybe a solution would for that would be to maybe have a doorknob just on the lower part of the door. No, yeah, because thing is that, so let's say if you've got a problem with your hand muscles, okay, I'm sure that people could use a sort of a doorknob that would be, or even like a button, okay, that you could actually use your foot to just bang or push, okay, in that respect, I say. So that instead of putting the actual lock in the middle of your door, of your entire door, put a lock on the bottom part of the door. Yes, I mean that could be a possible solution, but that was just my idea as such, thinking as such. I mean.
No, definitely. I mean, if you think about it, there's so many ways to approach how it would affect you in particular or someone else with those same conditions or same characteristics to use that door. I think the best one that's come about so far that's kind of universally used now is the automatic door, where it just senses movement. Obviously, that's not perfect either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that would
obviously
be
that's still not perfect. Like sometimes it'll pick up birds and dogs and stuff too. But yeah, definitely. Like, there's so many ways to think about it. So I'm glad you're thinking about how different product iterations can be, and how like unique those things are. I've definitely seen something with a foot though. It's like someone posted about how now that even folks who just use the handle doorknobs, like because of COVID and bacteria being spread, there's ways to just kind of open it with your foot.
And that you're touching a surface that then even that makes it even that makes it much more dangerous actually. Okay, as you know, because of the COVID-19 issue coming along. Okay, and people are really starting to trying not to touch any surfaces even for example in our house, for example, don't touch that unless you drown it in sanitizer or something.
Yeah. But yeah, well, thanks for sharing, Hamad. I mean, that's definitely very helpful to hear from someone who actually, encounters these on a day-to-day basis. So that's really helpful.
Then exactly, and actually, there's only one or two other things. The second thing was, remember you were saying that different manufacturers. I'm not talking about Microsoft right now specifically. Okay, I'm talking about in general. Okay, in general products. I'm not talking about tech. I'm just talking about in general products. So one product could be, okay, for example, when your food containers, yes, okay. So let's say you make food, okay. So, for example, in my household, normally, so I'm Pakistani. So, as you know, I'm sure, as you know, you might know that the Pakistanis like to cook a lot. They're quite extravagant dishes and everything. Okay.
Yeah.
And then what we tend to do is we if we got leftover quite some of it. Okay.
Yeah, we put it in the containers. Yeah.
Exactly. You obviously you seem like you know the idea. I can determine from your name, etc. So you might be possible that way. But the thing is that the problem with food containers is that I remember I just said that if you got muscle issues, okay, let's say in your hand muscles, and they create a problem even, and because of the hand muscles, then your dexterity goes off, finishes as well, right? Okay. You must have seen that even with food containers, the way the food container handles or the lids are designed, okay, even those are quite ridiculously irritating actually sometimes. That because you can't really take them because some of them might be in such a way that the actual container is wrapping all around the edge of the container, yes, and then you really need to dig in with the nail and that sort of thing to take it off, yes. And even, for example, in certain other containers, yes, you might have wraparound locks, small locks, I think 2-3 locks. Let's say if you got cylinder type container. Yes? Even with those, then you really need to use your strength again, actually. So I think that's another thing, actually, that I'm giving you as an example of a general product issue. So even, for example, if you have to take off the lid of a battery, let's say, of any other electronic device, okay? Now, in order to do that, you don't get that much easily claspable thing, and anything clasped to latch on to that you can take off the battery cover. Instead, what they do is that, so if you take the example of Bluetooth speakers, okay? So in some Bluetooth speakers, what they do is, in order to make it waterproof, okay, they encase the charging port and they put on a cover. And you know what? In order to do that, what they do is they don't give a small pull mechanism, okay, to do that easily. There's one example I would say is the LG X-Boom PK3. That's a Bluetooth speaker I've got. So, and that is really an interesting thing, actually, because you can't really open it easily, and then you need to really use a screwdriver. And as I said, if you've got dexterity problems, that creates a really big issue, actually. I think, and in terms of when you said that, governments are spending millions on that, I think that government is spending millions and wasting it. Because the thing is that in the end, government really needs to say to the industry of any products, okay, they need to bring in a law such, say that you are required by law that every single product you make, okay, has to pass a accessibility requirements test, okay?
Yeah.
Yes. If that test is not met at any stage of that accessibility requirement phase, your product will not go to market, won't go to market, and it should be denied application. I mean, I think that should be done. That definitely should be done. I think that should be really. Look, thing is, it might sound harsh from myself, from my side, but you see, the thing is that different industries have been given enough time. Because the thing is that I believe that if they're not taking this seriously, they're really shooting themselves in the foot. Because at the end of the day, they're missing out on a potential market, a potential same opportunity, if they really want to think of it in that respect, in profit terms.
Yeah, well, thanks for sharing about it. I mean, it's definitely good to hear insight from somebody who actually would benefit from these inclusions. So yeah, I mean, it's great to hear that you have actual thoughts about it. Yeah, I know it's hard to say not all governments are up to speed, and I think none of them are actually up to speed with accessibility concerns yet. So yeah, that's one of many solutions that hopefully could be implemented as people push for more policy change. I think that falls more under lawmakers and the whole political system. But definitely as companies are kind of making those changes, it's becoming more of a norm, and it's becoming more of something that people expect. So it's kind of like that whole supply demand thing. People are demanding that, so the supply is changing, and I think that does apply to the political context as well. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I know we're a little over time now, so I'll end the stream now, but thank you everyone for joining. The recording will be up in a day or two. And thanks for your kind words, and thanks for sharing, Hamad. Thanks for your comments, everyone. And we'll end the stream now. Thank you.